So, after the failure of the original German offensive into Russia, and to obviously the other countries that will ultimately become part of the Soviet Empire, the Ukraine and Belarus and so forth, which began, of course, with Operation Barbarossa in June 22nd, 1941. And you can get a good look here on this map of the shape that original offensive took. You had the three major frontal assaults, the southern one heading towards Kiev, the center to Smolensk, and ultimately to Moscow, and then, of course, the northern one to Leningrad, also today referred to as St. Petersburg. After the German offensive is stopped in the winter of 1941 and 1942, the Germans were stopped, surrounded. They encircled St. Petersburg or Leningrad, and Leningrad was barbarically besieged. The offensive also was stopped just outside, just a few miles outside of Moscow, and of course the Germans were absolutely entrapped by a very harsh Russian winter. A winter in which, in some cases, it got so cold that the fuel inside their tanks froze. After this winter, Hitler, for a brief moment, thinks that he has made a decision that would prevent the ultimate German defeat. And this involved his launching of a southern offensive in September of 1942 towards the south, and particularly towards the area around Stalingrad. Hitler's goal is not simply to take the city of Stalingrad. In a lot of respects, Stalingrad almost became a diverted obsession of Hitler. Instead, the goal that Hitler was planning here was to seize the oil fields in the Caucasus region to the south of Stalingrad. There's huge oil fields here, and Hitler thought that if he could seize these, one it would help the German war machine with needed resources, as the demands of the war were becoming increasingly huge, and two, it would prevent these from falling into the hand or being used by the Russians. During the course of this operation, the Germans will ultimately seize the city of Stalingrad, and Hitler will demand that the city be taken and controlled. He will, time and time again during this phase of the conflict, refuse to allow his military forces to strategically retreat. And this was a devastating mistake by Hitler and for his armies. Stalingrad was to a large degree a diversion away from the primary and most significant goal, which were the Caucasus oil fields. And the Nazis the German army could have seized those oil fields and controlled them without obsessing over Stalingrad. But Hitler was very much becomes obsessed with the city of Stalingrad. He refuses to allow his troops to retreat when they had a window to retreat. And Stalingrad ultimately, after the Nazis take it, will be seized and encircled by Russian forces. And it will turn into the most brutal battle of the entire war in all likelihood. So the Battle of Stalingrad lasted from August 1942 to February of 1943. The battle is ultimately remembered as perhaps the most destructive battle in all of human history. Well over 1 million casualties from this battle. This battle was part of a German effort to launch an offensive into the southeastern Europe, through the Ukraine, into the area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the area of the Caucasus, where they hoped they could seize the huge oil supplies in this region, thereby denying the Soviets of these resources for their army, as well as giving it to their own army. And they hoped that this could be the sort of big offensive that could bring the defeat of the Soviet Union. It was a gamble. The Nazis can only attack on one front. So if you remember the original invasion on June 22nd, 1941, you had three major columns, one towards St. Petersburg, the other towards Smolensk, and the other towards Kiev in the Ukraine. Now, in this case, you have one column, and that's a gamble. You expose a huge area of your flank. You run the risk of cutting your supply lines to your troops, but it was a huge risk, and they hoped that they could do this through blitzkrieg very quickly and obtain a very quick seizure of this area. They were unable to repeat these successes from 1942, and ultimately Hitler will be drawn into a battle for Stalingrad, the city, and Stalingrad was really an unnecessary target. It becomes the focal point of these entire campaigns, the significance of taking this city. But in truth, the city itself was not integral to the overall offensive to seize the Caucasus, and very much became a sort of almost like a diversion that Hitler obsessed with taking. The city began with a besiege of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe excessively bombed the city, indiscriminately targeting the urban area of the city. The Nazis then enter the city, and you have close quarters urban warfare. Eventually, the Nazis will push, the Germans will push the Soviets back to the edge of the Volga River. And it is here that the Soviets will finally launch a counterattack in which they cut the German lines on the outside of the city, and they encircle the city. After the encirclement, the German high command, the German military leadership, insisted that they should conduct a breakout operation in which the army would basically launch a retreat offensive in which they would break out through one point of the Soviet lines surrounding the city and begin a coordinated retreat from the area to prevent the loss of their entire 6th Army unit. Of course, Hitler refuses to do this. He insists that they will not surrender, that they will hold the city. Even though, again, the city itself was not imperative to the grand goal, which was to seize the Caucasus oil fields. The result of this ultimately is the city is surrounded, and the German 6th Army is ultimately going to have to surrender in February of 1943 due to a lack of ammunition, to a lack of food, and so forth. The total casualties from the battle are over 1 million, and it's a massive strategic and psychological defeat for the Germans. The Germans in the battle had suffered a strategic defeat because they had lost the 6th Army, and it was a crushing psychological defeat because of the scale of this setback to the German goal. And it was clear that at this time, now it was clear that the blitzkrieg strategy of trying to defeat the Soviet Union relatively quickly and take them out of this war was not going to happen. It was clear now that Germany was descending into a reality of total warfare, and that any hope of defeating the Soviets quickly was now completely gone. So it's a strategic and a psychological defeat, and from this point you will see a consistent withdrawal or retreat, slow retreat of Germany as the Soviet Union increasingly gains the upper hand in the war. And of course, this moment really marks the turning point for the German war effort in general as well. You do see other sort of counteroffensives by the Germans after this event. In the summer of 1943, you have the Battle of Kursk, in which the Germans try to launch a counteroffensive against a bulge in the Soviet lines near Kursk. You also have the Battle of the Bulge from the Western Front that I'm sure some of you guys have heard of. But both of those offensives were not these kind of large-scale blitzkrieg offensives that were designed to take another country out of the war quickly. Instead, these offensives were simply strategically designed to halt the enemy's advance. They were really defensive counteroffensives. And so you really see the slow retreat and destruction of Germany following Stalingrad. This battle came at tremendous consequences. The casualties are unthinkable, and it was incredibly destructive not only for the Germans but for the Soviets, who took by far the largest amount of casualties and actually came into the battle. They actually came into the battle relatively unprepared. In fact, there's stories that Nikita Khrushchev told of the battle in which soldiers were sent in to fight with only a magazine and bullets, without a gun itself, because they didn't have enough guns for their soldiers, and they were given the command that when your comrade is killed, you pick up his gun and fight with it. It was a desperate time for the Soviets, as well as ultimately the Germans. If you deserted from the Soviet lines, you would be shot. And so the destruction and just totality of this type of battle, if that makes any sense, is really unthinkable. And it's a crushing defeat for the Nazis, but it came at a tremendous cost to the Soviets, who, in terms of life lost, the Soviets suffer the most in the Second World War. Here is a German soldier after the defeat in Stalingrad, with the Soviet soldier, of course, behind him. The Battle of Stalingrad is really unprecedented in the scale of loss of human lives. Casualty figures are debated just because of the sheer number of people and the difficulty with documenting this. Um, Generally, it's accepted that Soviet casualties are over 1 million, and that German casualties, and their allies, of course, too. You have to remember that Germany has Romanian units, Croatian units, and so forth, suffered over 800,000 casualties. On the lower left, you see the German dead at Stalingrad, just absolutely littering the ground. And of course, you see a column of POWs, the surviving members of the German 6th Army, being marched to prison camps. The German soldiers over the course of the war would much more eagerly surrender to the British or the Americans than they would to the Soviets. The Soviets were pretty notoriously bad to their POWs, and if you were captured by the Soviets, the likelihood would be that there was a great likelihood that you would never come home ever again. By contrast, the British and the Americans were known to treat their POWs pretty well. Most of the people that you see in this picture here would have gone to prison camps and died in captivity. The vast majority of these individuals would never have come back to Germany again.